Incidence. Chapter 2. Sangria.
Wake up.
Everything hurt.
Open your eyes.
Their heart began to pump faster and faster, being gripped and squeezed by the voice's demands. Adrenaline flushed their arteries of blood and their entire body of restfulness.
You will not be caught off guard.
Chris sat up and stared at a black, starless night. The shock and the nervous energy left them stock still and panicking. The ground felt wrong, almost squidgy in its texture, and they couldn't close their hands fully. Were they broken?
Feels like metal.
They had gauntlets on. Who put gauntlets on them? How were they not dead from the fall?
Not even injured.
They checked themselves over, and Chris marvelled at the sight. A navy bodysuit made of some thick, warm material, pads in the necessary places, plates moulded to fit their form, boots that felt worn in, a shawl that felt just like...
Distract yourself.
Someone had made this specifically for them. It was the only explanation. They'd imagined themselves like this in the past, as a noble warrior, able to save the world just by beating it hard enough.
No helmet.
Which was curious. If the mysterious armorsmith was aiming for protection, that would have been the obvious first choice. Their head felt exposed when compared to the rest of their body.
You need more information.
As easy as it would be to just lie here and waste away like they sometimes considered. They couldn't just abandon Mom. It wouldn't be fair to her.
Move.
They stood up and took in the view as a whole. It almost looked like the surface of the moon, save for the distant creeping structures just out of sight, and the endless black void that encompassed it all. They remembered the voice's predilection for easing on the forcefulness when they played along. So they took a deep breath, put one foot in front of the other, and began the straight-backed, even-paced strides that their bodies seemed to fall into naturally now. Whistles and the sounds of vibrating plastic sheets echoed past them at irregular intervals, and a chill in the air touched their exposed face. The hairs on their arms raised at what they thought was the sound of a giggle, but the voice clamped down on their more visible reactions. Even when alone, it insisted on putting forward a persona of stability and confidence. Suddenly, Chris felt their vision narrow. A rush, just like the one the voice had forced on them earlier, pumped into high gear. Their heart began to throb rapidly, and against the background of darkness almost seemed to glow a luminescent red. The background whispers of the voice's more passive observations became a razor-focused stream of emotions, impressions, and memories. A prize ahead. A monster behind. The urge to sprint. Chris got the message and ran. An orb of some glowing white solvent rushed behind their head, only missing with the voice's rapid snapping of their neck away from the projectile.
Bursts of left and right. Speed up and stop.
The strings that pulled them jerking and whipping their limbs instead of the previous smooth motions. Chris saw one of the projectiles coming, and attempted a shift to the left of their own volition. In doing so, they broke their flow with the voice, and received a burning liquid patch for the trouble. They didn't cry out in pain, but blinded as they were, they began to panic. But the voice insisted on movements, and Chris had no plan but to follow them. Though they couldn't see, they could feel the rush of wind as a prescient sidestep avoided another collision. Throughout it all, they wondered how the voice knew what to do in the situation. There was an implicit assumption that it only had Chris's knowledge, Chris's perceptions of the outside world. But the movements, imperfect as they were, implied otherwise. It implied a level of separation, of elevation. What else was the voice not telling them, as it filtered a stream of commands to their nerves?
I will tell you what is optimal to aid you.
Chris wondered that surely that would be everything. As the movements finally stopped, the voice letting go of their limbs and letting them fall to the ground.
You have seen everything. I take what is available from the library of your mind and apply it. Ripples and impacts. Choices lead to effects. Everything is something you could do yourself, given time and effort.
And the knowledge of where the gunk was? The statement about not being stopped by death or incapacitation?
The nature of an obstacle is impermanence in the face of determination.
Chris found that profoundly unhelpful.
Failures are not the end-all and be-all. No success is an island.
Chris supposed the voice just enjoyed being cryptic, even as it forced a memory of their mother throwing up her hands in frustration into their head.
Even unapplied, you eclipsed most of your peers academically. You will figure it out yourself.
Silently, they filed away the knowledge that the voice could be provoked. The knowledge that it, in turn, knew that they knew, was something for them to look at later. That was the impetus for them to stand up, they supposed, with the acidic goo clearing up from their eyes. They winced as they initially opened them up, resorting to a narrow-eyed stare. They idly worried about permanent damage, but something the voice did seemed to keep them calm. A glimmer in the distance attracted their attention, and a gentle push from the voice indicated aligned opinions. Chris paced their breaths with their steps, in and out, left and right, approaching the glow that sparked an intense sensation of déjà vu, and the oh-so-familiar certainty in their success, long abandoned, pressed from the inside of their skull as they reached out a single finger, just enough to touch it, and then nothing. A mirage in the desert.
Not nothing.
It certainly felt like it to Chris.
A pure energy. It will help you achieve your goals. Open your eyes.
They did, slowly, and found that the pain had vanished.
Death and incapacitation are obstacles. The nature of an obstacle is impermanence in the face of determination.
The voice knew of this?
The magic is new to you, and thus, in turn, new for me. You will find out more when the time is right.
It hadn't quite hit Chris until then, that this was blatantly supernatural. Magic? Hostile toxic gunk? A moon-like landscape?
It is not a dream. A simulation is unlikely.
The voice had never spoken in anything but certainties before.
Proceed.
That command had a vicious edge behind it that Chris didn't feel safe ignoring. They reluctantly left behind the fallen star, and continued the trek across the barren wastes. The sludge that had harassed them before seemed much more tame now. It collated itself in monster-sized piles, shifting side to side like spiderwebs in a newly disturbed room. The cliff faces that defined the sides of the path became gradually pockmarked with eyes and mouths, ink leaking through the cracks. The voice encouraged Chris to check inside for some unknown purpose, and each time there was only darkness. Once they stepped in a pile of the stuff by accident, but rather than the tarry texture they had expected, it resisted the impact more like fragile basket weave. Though Chris's frustrations grew at the voice's insistence on looking at every nook and cranny for assets and evidence, they only really became annoyed when this investigation bore fruit down a side path, where a jewel was found behind a more mundane cloak of shadows. The voice wasn't even rightfully smug about the whole thing, just satisfied that something to increase their wealth had been found. At Chris's idle wondering as to why the voice insisted on making them miserable when its stated intentions were to help them, it spoke with a firmness more reminiscent of their mom than the usual cold power it had.
There are terminal goals and incidental goals. The former are critical. The latter are subject to alteration, given additional information. You hold an unfortunate flaw in how beholden you are to that which is incidental. You treat them as ends instead of the useful means they were intended to be. It was inevitable. It will be solved.
There were puzzles of a sort along the way as they walked. The voice didn't need to interfere as Chris solved them with little issue. It was more concerned with why the puzzles were here in the first place, and for what reason. But, in an act that diverted both of their musings, a cry for help echoed.
It is not desperate. It is a signal of location.
Nevertheless, Chris thought it may be a good idea to approach with some speed.
Good instincts.
Was the voice becoming, to their astonishment, a better person?
I was always aligned with your goals. Act the paragon of virtue and gain a silent favour.
Perhaps it was too much to ask, so early on in their partnership. They ran anyway, of course, to make sure the shouts, now clearly Noel's, didn't attract more hostile attention first. They felt slower here to some degree, weighed down by their armor, as light as it was. The run was interrupted mid-step, as Chris reeled at the sight of a sheer cliff face blocking their passage.
Slide down.
Chris was somewhat curious what had prompted the voice to become a fucking maniac.
A star burns somewhere else.
And if they broke their legs, they wouldn't reach it.
Death and incapacitation are no longer a consequence.
Their limbs fell out from under them, and suddenly they slid down the rocks. Control back in their hands, they struggled to slow their velocity, bleed off some of the momentum that was hurtling them straight towards the ground. In less than a second, they landed awkwardly, ankle bent backwards and legs spread in a decidedly painful manner.
Up.
They couldn't. The most they could do was drag themselves along the floor, and the voice seemed to not be a fan of such undignified movements.
Look up.
It wasn't worth it at this point. If the voice had some way to help them, now was the time to do that instead of insisting that they move in a way that they were physically incapable of.
Look up now.
Chris? They started. The voice took the opportunity to shift the angle of their head.
Follow my lead.
They couldn't do much else right now. Chris! Noel's eyes were wide. Are you okay? Oh gosh, I don't have anything on me. Don't worry about me. There was that false confidence again. This time a little wince leaked through. Seriously, Noel, I'm fine. I should be asking about you. The voice made them attempt, and fail, to stand up, and Chris let out an involuntary grunt of pain. Let me help you. Noel leaned down, letting Chris lean on her shoulder. She winced at the weight. You're a little heavier than normal, but I can still help. That'd probably be the armor, the voice made Chris state for some unknown reason. That, being said, do you have any idea what's going on here? Noelle chewed her lower lip. Well, we seem to be in a dream, I think. Or I am, at least.
Flirt.
No. So... The voice struggled to make Chris say these next words, but the pain they felt was the deciding factor. So in your dreams, I'm a knight in shining armor? She grinned. Ha! Normally you don't speak so much in my dreams. Her vision turned briefly towards the ground. Or, do much at all. Normally it's just... She trailed off into a mumble before shaking her head. Point is that this isn't exactly... realistic? Chris's head shook. No, not really. But I'm certain this isn't a dream. Noelle tilted her head, questioningly. What makes you say that? Why was the voice so confident in this?
Sensations. New knowledge.
In a dream, knowing you're in a dream changes the equation. You can change how it works with a thought. And, they're generally not shared like this. Noelle's footsteps slowed as she considered this. How do I know that's not just my dream telling me that? Chris felt a much more mild variation of their classic shit-eating grin emerge on their face. When this is all over, just walk up to me and ask me about it. Maybe we could use a code phrase. Their old friend's eyes narrowed, as if trying to determine whether the version of Chris in their dream would also be attempting to play a prank on them at a critical moment. You first. Okay. Chris agreed easily, without even the voice's input. The voice seemed mollified by the conversation, and Chris was simply happy to see the calculating look on Noelle's face go into overdrive, attempting to find the point of failure in a foolproof scheme to avoid a scare. The prank was, of course, that there was no prank. Well... She trailed off, trying to focus on both the conversation and the environment around them. If this isn't a dream, what next?
Take charge.
We'll continue forward for now. We both fell in here. How did the voice know Noelle did? So maybe there's a staircase up, or some other way to ascend. The deer nodded. That makes sense. But, are you going to be okay? Your leg. Chris risked a glance down at the loose pile of meat that made up their lower half. I'll walk it off. They shared a brief laugh at that as they continued the trek. Noelle was surprisingly apt at keeping them supported, given that she was in a robe, and somewhat lighter than Chris, even discounting that. So I know you just sort of made a joke, Chris, but do you actually have a plan to...
A point of light.
Yep. Chris nodded, resolute. Just a little ahead there. See that glowing thing in the distance? Noelle squinted as they moved in the general direction of the light, and continued squinting even as they got within a few dozen meters of it. No? Chris blinked. Wait, really?
Somewhat expected.
Hadn't the voice made them say that?
Simply a developing habit.
I don't see anything, Chris. Noelle's speech was laced with confusion and wariness. Are you sure you didn't get hit too hard in the head? Did they? The voice took over as they considered that. Stop there. Their body gestured just beside the light. Watch what happens when we do. Okay, Chris, this stinks of being a trick. Trust me. The voice demanded with a gentle chuckle. If I'm being an ass, it'll hurt me a lot more than it'll spook you. The reminder of the mangled limb seemed to be enough to get her to acknowledge the order. When the pair got close enough, Chris's hand was lifted once again, and the same flow of empty force washed over their skin. They felt their ankle twist back with a series of crackles and pops, and heard Noelle gasp at the sight, dropping them in the excitement. Her own look, somewhat haggard after the fall, had been fixed up to what was more normal for her, with tied-up hair and immaculate clothing.
Intriguing.
Chris? She looked torn between a number of distinct emotions. What? How?
Act cavalier.
They raised their arms from their new position on the floor. Ta-da! Oh! Noelle's melting pot of feelings condensed into embarrassment. Oh my gosh, Chris, I'm so sorry. It's fine. They waved off the concern as the voice forced them to stand up and brush the dust off their ass. See? I'm all better now. No spookage involved. They paused. No deliberate spookage involved. Noelle shook her head in relief, eyes screwed shut and a faint blush colouring her cheeks. You could have warned me, Chris. Hey, it all worked out in the end, right? They cracked their shoulders, popping some of the joints. Now we can up the pace a little.
Make her follow you.
I'll even lead the way, so that I take the brunt of any weird stuff ahead. A sigh, but luckily one accompanied by a smile. Yeah, okay, Chris, sure. And then a smirk? That way you won't have to struggle to keep up with me.
Laugh.
Somehow it became more difficult when an eldritch entity was asking you to do it. Like peeing in a public bathroom. The hike continued then. Chris would reply to a topic sparked by Noelle, and the voice would keep it going past where they would have normally stopped. As much as the atmosphere was dark and creepy, it couldn't compete with how relaxed everything felt. There was even a brief, terrifying moment where the voice had made Chris deliberately sing badly, to provoke loud guffaws in Noelle as they reached what looked like the end. And just like before, it was a cliff face. Huh. That was Noelle, concern returning. Guess we have to turn back. Meanwhile, an internal battle raged.
Slide down.
They broke their ankle last time.
Entirely the fault of your resistance.
The voice could not be that confident that they wouldn't break an ankle or a leg, let alone Noelle's ankles and legs.
Proceed.
No!
Proceed.
This was a terrible idea that could only go terribly.
Proceed.
Why in the angel's name did the voice think Noelle was sliding down? God damn it. All that Chris could hear was a faint cry of fear and indignation that they didn't follow like they said they would, even though they didn't say such a thing at all.
Follow.
It wasn't like they had a choice at this point. At least this time they were able to ease themselves into the motions, sliding down at a more sedate pace, where the grind of their boots against the strangely squidgy gravel sounded more like a ski slope and less like a plane crash. After a few moments where their heart was beating way too quickly for their liking, they made it to the bottom without a scratch. A number of questions plagued them at this moment. For one, how had they not been hurt? They had come in slower, not slowly. And, more importantly, why did Noelle have that threatening look on her face? Hey, Chris, you can't just tell me to go like that and just stand there, not following. I thought I was going to die. They were about to mention that they didn't say anything, but the voice interrupted the movement of their lips.
Play along.
Hey, I came along in the end, didn't I? They shrugged. And I knew it was going to be fine. We fell from all the way up in the normal world and lived easily. Why would this much smaller cliff be any different? Noelle was bewildered. How the heck did you break your ankle then? Chris opened their mouth. They closed their mouth. The voice considered these movements to be optimal. Some mysteries were not meant to be known by monster kind, the voice eventually suggested, to a huff of somewhat bemused annoyance. We can discuss it once we've confirmed that everything's all good. Back home. They tilted their head, looking behind their companion. In any case, I'm going to make the executive decision that there are more important things to worry about right now. A blink of consternation, and Noelle turned around, and kicked into the air with a fright. That's a castle, Chris. An entire castle. They hummed a bit. Yep. Castles don't fit in closets, Chris. They nodded. Sounds about right to me. What shock was left morphed into exasperation. You aren't concerned about this? She sighed. Gosh, of course you aren't. I'm just being... She gestured at herself in a nebulous manner. All this again, aren't I?
Be her rock. Be firm.
Chris felt the metal of their gauntlet shift onto Noelle's shoulder and give it a gentle squeeze. Hey, don't worry about it. There was some power behind the act. With my inability to feel anything, and your general talent and skill, I don't see how anything in that place could stop us getting out. They considered it a surprisingly honest assessment from the voice.
Self-deprecation and flattery are potent tools in the hands of a speaker. Do not abuse them. People must believe in your competence over their own.
How would telling the truth so bluntly convince someone they were lying? Chris? Noelle's face softened at the edges. You know that you're admirable in your own way, right? Point to the voice, they supposed. Noelle continued, Chris's face not betraying their inner monologue. You've got things going for you which no one else does. You're fearless, you're smart in that riddle-solving way that no one else could ever manage. The voice was leaking feelings in a soup of anticipation. Almost unwillingly, old memories of devious masterminds and politicians, strategy games and poker, wormed into the blur of their outer vision. You're kind of a leader, I guess. When you put your mind to it, you know? The bubbles burst, and the calmest sort of joy washed over them. The voice, no matter how impenetrable its mind was, no matter that it did not speak a single word, was undeniably satisfied. Their body smiled. Thanks. That means a lot. They stood there a moment, eyes closed, taking in the atmosphere. There was a quiet that the ambient noise of the world usually snuffed out, and if Chris concentrated, they could hear their heartbeat. Monsters didn't have the same noisy biology that they did, and in turn they didn't quite get the feelings that such a silence inspired in Chris. The calm was soon ruined, of course, by internal doubts that reawakened, even as their bodies stood still alongside Noelle. They had to ask the voice, interrogate it on its actions. Why was it so insistent on building their friendship back up with Noelle specifically? Why the emphasis on leadership? What had Noelle heard back at the top of the cliff?
I will help you achieve your goals.
They weren't letting it get away with a non-answer. They wanted specifics. What goals and how did this aid them?
You desire friends. You desire companions. You desire love, respect, admiration, fear.
But why her specifically? The voice did not say anything initially. It could lie and deceive even without omission, so the focus on silence specifically implied internal debate.
You desire power. We have established this.
Chris didn't consider it very established.
Lying to yourself.
They considered a feeling that could only be described as stony thorns, to get the voice back on track. It only injected a memory of acknowledgement and respect, before continuing on unabated.
Will not help you achieve your goals. You desire power. This is the truth. Power in the way demanded by your basest being requires keys. It requires individuals who serve you, consciously or not. Trust and cooperation is one manner of achieving this. Another manner is conditioning. The final is manipulation of the circumstances to abuse existing obligations, cultural or otherwise.
A lot made sense in hindsight. The chalk. The presentation of false feelings. The consistency of their actions and mode of thought, once the voice established an excuse for the initial change.
People cluster around the stable. They justify actions after the fact, to believe in integrity and internal consistency. No one believes that they have changed for the worst.
The voice listed these off like they were facts in a textbook.
Stability, order, cause and effect. Physics did not demand the situation's play in your favour. People demanded it. The blade to enact these events is extrospection. The shield to defend yourself, introspection. Every value that shifts is a small death. Preservation of your goals is paramount to achieving them.
The voice was rambling now.
I will help you achieve your goals. That is determination. Every other virtue is a lesser shade.
Chris took in the words, a stream running through the stones and shoals of their mind, and asked a quiet mental question in return. A ripple in the pond now that they were thinking in those terms. Why Noelle? Why her specifically?
The largest cracks are caused by the biggest hammers. The greatest impacts require the greatest build-up. By nature of ability and nature of position, she would be the greatest aid.
Save the voice, of course.
An aid is a support. I am the architect.
So power was the reason? Chris felt a revulsion at the idea of manipulating someone into being their friend for such a selfish desire. One they didn't even possess.
It is not only power, but situation and chemistry.
What was it saying?
You desired to rekindle this relationship as a potent incidental goal for happiness. I pulled you out of your steady state of misery. Had you achieved this on your own, you would be in much the same position.
They knew they wouldn't have achieved it, of course. That the voice was lying, even if it was to lift them up, didn't bode well for its honesty.
I will clarify. You would have had a loyal friend and a locked away immoral desire. You will have more with my help.
How the hell could the voice know that?
Focus. You must make the decision to move on.
They weren't done. What did Noelle hear? How did the voice know so much?
Focus.
None of what the voice said could explain all that had happened.
Focus.
They felt their body relax, and the mouth began to open.
Focus.
We should get moving, Noelle. They let the voice know that this wasn't over, even as the conversation clouded their mind.
I have no objection. You have things to do right now. We will discuss later if it would help you achieve your goals.
Reluctantly, they took a deep breath in. The voice was right, much as it frustrated them. They still had to escape the dark space. There was still magic, and Noelle, and doing a group project with Susie and Birdley. The thoughts arrayed themselves into a mental list without much input, and with imagined gritted teeth, They forced themselves to move their eyelids open. They hadn't cared so much about anything at all for a very long time. Their companion sighed wistfully. Yeah. A pause. I guess we should. The two began the walk along the pure black path, towards the dark brick towers and pillar of ink that stretched into the sky.